All right. Thank you all for coming to Art at the Cave. If you've never been here before or don't know much about it, I'll give you a brief history. We opened in 2017. The gallery is owned by Ann Ruttan. Typically what we do is monthly exhibits that feature between 1 to 5 artists per exhibit. And that's kind of how we started doing shows. We change out the exhibits every month. And then come 2020 and the fires and the COVID, we sort of switched our structure and started doing more group shows, more community shows, and providing a space for local groups because of all the public places closing down, basically, right? So we started hosting some of the local arts groups. Now that those public spaces are opening back up, we're sort of shifting our strategy to a combination of both. So we've blended into having lots of open calls, maybe 2 or 3 a year, and then hosting 1 or 2 or 3 artists. We're so excited to have this exhibit. It's been really powerful. It's something that everybody can relate to in the region. And I want to give a special thanks to Grace Teagan and to Jane Degenhardt for turning us on to these artists and letting us know about this. Thank you. So today we're going to hear from Ann Ruttan, Sarah Grew, and Apricot Irving.
So this book is my first book, The Gospel of Trees. It was due to my editor the day that we ended up evacuating to the Eagle Creek fire. And so at 4 a.m, I sent her an email in New York and said, I don't think I'm going to make that deadline. We had been all night packing up 15 years worth of source documents, kids' clothes and favorite toys, and ash was falling from the sky. It was 90 degrees at midnight. The elk were clustered in the meadow. And we'll get more to this by the end with the fire-wise stuff, but we didn't have a plan. We'd never imagined fire coming so close, and we didn't have evacuation plans in order. So mine is not a model of what to do when fire comes. But what I did do is the thing I always do, which is I write. And so when we had everything loaded and it was the middle of the night and it wasn't like we were in imminent danger, so we were like, okay, pause. When do we actually leave? I think we have an hour. I sat at the kitchen table and I wrote. And I had been rereading all my parents' journals in order to write this book. They were missionaries in Haiti. They did agricultural reforestation. So I grew up since 6 years old, heavy with the worry about our planet in crisis and what our human impact on our changing landscapes can be, and the magnitude and severity and grief of that. And so there I was at my kitchen table writing, and I ended up rewriting just one paragraph of this book that talks about the Eagle Creek fire. So that's what I'm going to read to you. And I had, to just set the scene, I had been writing for a little stretch of time at the Franciscan Sisters home in Bridal Veil. It's magnificent. They have their own waterfall. It's this 1920s Italianate manor house that is over the top and amazing, and they bought it in complete disrepair in the 1960s, and now it houses nuns who run this environmental earth school, this Montessori earth school, and they very graciously gave me a little space to write for a couple days, and so I would disappear from my then small children and go and write. So I was there worrying again about the environment, worrying about the ivy in the woods. So I went on a walk. I noticed a gap in the rain and I pulled on my boots for a walk. There were birds hidden in the dug fir trees and a waterfall thundered endlessly. Within minutes, I felt restored to stillness. Until, that is, I noticed a green rope of ivy starting to work its way around the trunk of a fir tree, and my father's fierce dislike of invasive species took hold. Ivy has already strangled thousands of acres of Northwest woods. Once it reaches a height of 2 or 3 feet, it circles the tree trunks and puts out dark berries to tempt the birds. The seeds shat out on other sections of the forest, spreading the blight. I reached down to uproot a tuft of ivy. A long, white, feathery root clung to the soil. Dead, matted leaves and pine needles fell aside as I yanked harder, pulling up its latticework of roots. It was satisfying work until I started to think about how each overlooked root fragment would shove out new growth, and these were not my woods. I would not be there to ensure that whatever I inadvertently left behind would be uprooted later. I paused, dirt under my fingernails, palms already aching, and realized that I could spend all morning pulling ivy and never finish the job. What was the point of trying if in the end it was a losing battle? I thought of my father in the deforestation of Haiti, the numbing downward spiral. I didn't want to admit defeat and walk away, but it felt like a hopeless task. I reached for a tuft of glossy leaves, then realized that they were connected to a massive root as big around as my thumb. I braced myself against a tree trunk and pulled, and it ripped loose. And I realized that it had been cut long before with pruning shears. Someone had already been here. My mind leaped ahead with immense relief. Others would follow. It was not up to me to complete the work. As humans, we are capable of leaving enormous desolation in our wake. No old-growth trees remained after the loggers broke camp in the Columbia River Gorge. And even now, a handful of fireworks carelessly tossed can torch 30,000 acres of wilderness in a matter of days. In Haiti, after 5 centuries of plunder, little remains of the rainforest that Columbus once described as immeasurably lush and green. And yet, even if the meager biodiversity that survives represents only a shadow of the Earth's former glory, it is still worth protecting. We are more aware than we used to be of our fragility. We too are learning the hard way about drought, fires, floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes. If we do not rein in our appetite for consumption, we will lose landscapes and creatures that we can never replace. Sorry. As a recovering missionary's daughter, it feels like something of a consolation to realize that the part I have to play in protecting this beloved earth is laughably small. It is not mine alone to save, but it matters that we care. Love might only be a broken song, but I can still add my voice to that faltering music. I left the ripped up ivy dangling from a snowberry bush, for I had other work to complete, a book to write, children to love, students to encourage. I repeated a benediction under my breath. Let it be enough. Thank you.
It's so amazing to hang out with these people who are going through a lot of the same stuff that I am. I went off one day, the last day of the holiday in September of 2020, driving from our house down to Salem, going over to Sisters to ride our horse. And it was kind of windy, and it was late in the afternoon, which was great because the traffic on 217, it was a breeze getting there, but a lot of wind blowing. And I kept thinking, well, when I turn off and go up the pass, that will all fall away. And it didn't. And I turned off and headed up there. And over on the north side of the highway, the Opal Creek fire had been burning in the far wilderness for probably a week and a half. And I couldn't see it. I could see smoke, but I thought, well, that's Opal Creek over there still going. I had no idea what was going on all night. As I kept going, the wind kept getting worse, and I thought, what's happening here? This is really wild. At Staten, it was just like occasional leaves ripped off trees flying around. Pretty soon, I get nervous just remembering it, to tell you the honest truth. Out here and keep going. As I went along, I got closer and closer to Mill City, then Gates, and then Tumble Creek, which comes down and goes eventually into Detroit Lake. I could not see Detroit Lake right next to my car. The wind blew so hard I thought the car might blow into the lake. I could not figure out what was happening. There were no sparks and no flames, but the sky was that orange back there. And that's where I was, going into this experience like I've never had. Pretty soon my phone went off and it said, "Get out of the Jefferson Wilderness now." And I thought, oh my God, 9 hours later, what are they talking about? And I called my friend and sisters, and she said, there is a fire, but it's behind. And I thought she means the Opal Creek fire. It's back there. So you can't turn around and go back because it's coming. But at least I'm not driving into it, because there was also at that time the Lions Head fire in the Jefferson Wilderness. And there was the Beachy Creek fire, which is right by Detroit. And I knew those fires, well, I knew about Opal Creek and Lions Head. I didn't know about Beachy. It was the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. It changed my life. I'm not quite done with the story, so I'll go back to the story. I'm sorry. After Detroit, there's what I'd always thought of in my own mind as the tunnel of trees, where the highway gets close and the trees are there. And for a while, they logged a few trees on the side because they were, I'm sure, thinking of windfall. Those trees were blowing so hard, they weren't lying on the ground. I'm sure they really weren't, but it seemed like they were. It was just like, and all I could do was keep going. I couldn't go back. There were lots of cars going home from the holiday weekend. It was as black as pitch and brilliant orange at the same time. And I just kept going. And when I got to Marion Forks, the sky cleared, blue skies, no, what? I felt like I'd just driven through some kind of a strange nightmare. And I really had, because it was the beginning of the San Juan Canyon fire, the third biggest fire in Oregon's history. 3 towns, Mill City, Gates, and Detroit, wiped out. A couple of people were killed, and it's amazing that only a couple. There were 13 ignition spots from the PPI wires in that narrow canyon past Detroit. They hadn't turned their electricity off, so those fires just sparked there. And it was absolutely massive. And then Marv and I, that road was closed for 2 weeks at least. And sometimes the next time we went on that road, there were snags standing with fires still inside them. It was a devastated gray landscape. And these are from Opal Creek. I looked online, and there was a special on PBS. They went into Opal Creek after the fire. I have not been able to go in there. I thought that they had opened it up for people, but I was wrong. They haven't. Those pictures, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Opal Creek, but the beautiful turquoise pools and turquoise water gone. That's what's left. And we've, okay, so wait, I'm trying to get organized in this thinking. So that there's a story of going through the fire. And then I came home and got to knowing the Portland Fire Department, people who are starting Firewise communities around Forest Park. And we live on the edge of Forest Park. We are in such grave danger. And I don't mean just us, all of us are. Those fires can travel so fast. The one in the Dalles explains that to you. But I don't want you to feel like there's nothing you can do about it, because there is. I'm going to tell you a couple of things, and you can ask me all kinds of fire questions, or any kind later is fine. You can harden your home. It takes time and energy. You don't have to do it, but 95% of fires that burn, houses that burn in wildfires, are caused by embers getting into the house, ember storms that are driven by those huge winds. I was driving through that, the embers just haven't gotten there yet. And you can fix your house, so probably it will be safe. Hardening the home is the most important thing you can do for yourself and your neighbors. And the other thing I'd like to suggest to people is that they talk to each other about this. Because because we're all in this, and we can all make a little bit of difference. Everybody's difference is their own contribution. But if you travel through your life and look around and think about what can I do to help, things will pop up that will work for you. You might be a vintner and you'll be able to talk to people who are wine about wildfire or climate change, or you might talk to your neighbor who has a propane tank sitting on their barbecue right next to their house. There are lots of things you can do, big and small. Hi, that's okay. And I can feel myself about to take off preaching, so I'll quit. But please feel free to ask questions anytime. Oh, my daughter told me after this Sandy Ann Canyon experience, she said, Mom, you should paint that. And thank you for reminding me of that. She said, you should paint that. And that's how all these paintings came to be. And this morning I was walking in the woods thinking about, I think I was thinking about our process. And I realized all my life I've painted landscapes. And how it happens for me is I think, oh my God, that's beautiful. And then I go home and try. In my head, I'm Vincent van Gogh, and then I go home and there's the reality of what kind of, how it's going to, what I'm challenged to try and do. And I very rarely have gotten there, but it's always something. I think that's what happens, how we process things. And this has been a great thing for me because I can still feel it. I know it's real when I go to our house and if I'm lying in bed at night hearing the wind blowing, I'm thinking, oh my God. So that's how my paintings came to be. And if you guys have questions ever after this time you want to talk about paint products or any of the technical parts of painting, I'll be glad to talk to you. Thank you. Oh, you've got one.
So I'm Sarah Guru, and I'm the photographer whose work is, one piece is here in the middle, the rest are up there. And I'm doing carbon printing, and what I do is I have gone to the sites of various fires. So far, only about 15, but 15 wildfire sites is quite a few for how they feel in your heart when you go to them. And I found myself in 2020 after the Holiday Farm fire, the Beachy Creek fire, the Opal Creek fire, the Lions Head fire, all of these fires, and the Eagle Creek fire, I found myself just going, oh, what can I do? I can't stand it. It's so painful for me. I felt personally like it was just painful that these fires were happening and I felt like nobody's listening. The earth is on fire. No one's doing anything. We have to do something. What can I do? And I'd go to these fire sites and collect burned pieces of wood. And so I collected a number of burned pieces of wood, and I didn't really know what I would do with it because really I'm both a photographer and a painter, and I wasn't going to paint with my burned wood. And I started thinking about it, and then one day it just hit me. I'd gone to a fire site. I live in Eugene, so the closest fire was the Holiday Farm fire, and which was only like the evacuation zone was fairly close to where we were, and so I went out there to take photographs of the burned material, and I was there, and all of a sudden I thought, I could do carbon printing. And I've had I always describe myself as a closet science nerd. And I've had a long history of being interested in science and in scientific processes and in climate change and all these things. And so one of my earlier projects, right previous to this one, was also a climate change project in which I was using photographs I took as an artist in residence on a science research boat off the coast of Oregon and Northern California, and we were photographing the plankton and studying the effects of the climate change on the zooplankton food web. And so I was thinking about climate change and I was using cyanotype for that project, and that cyanotype was invented in 1842, and photography was only patented in in 1839. And so it was a really new thing when cyanotype came out. It was one of the first processes that worked in terms of photography that stayed on the paper. And so I was using that process for my first project, and I won't go into the details on why, but there were reasons for it. And so, but another really early photographic process, printing process, that is still the most archival process that exists was carbon printing. And it was invented in 1855. Climate change was first measured in 1856. This gives you an idea of how long climate change has been going on and how little we've actually done to slow things down. But so I thought carbon printing, and I immediately started grinding up burned wood and making a paste out of my burned ash and creating the tissue that we use to make the carbon prints. And because people say, how do you make photographs out of ash? I'm going to try and be brief. It's a complicated process, but I'm going to try and really briefly tell you. And essentially what I do is I make this paste of burned ash and water, and I mix it into a gelatin emulsion. And probably most of you have heard of a gelatin silver print, which is the standard for black and white photography. That gelatin silver print, it's the same gelatin of that name, but there's no silver in a carbon process. In the carbon process, you mix your carbon into the gelatin, and most people use ink or some other pigment that's pre-made, so it's really fine. I spend hours grinding instead, and then you pour it out onto a sheet of what we're going to call tissue, although it's actually a thin plastic. I pour it out onto that, and it has to be perfectly level so that the paper that's holding it is we'll have it all perfectly the same thickness. And I pour it out so that it's 1 millimeter thick, and I let it dry, which in Oregon takes 3 days, approximately 2 to 3 days. And then I take it into the dark room and chemically sensitize it to light. Meanwhile, and let it dry again. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in front of my computer, and I convert my digital image into a digital negative, and I print out a digital negative onto a sheet of acetate. Then carbon printing, like most of the early processes of photo printing, is a contact printing process, which means my negative has to be the same size as my final print. So my negative for this image is a little bit bigger than this. So then I expose that. I have my tissue sheet and my negative on top of it, sandwiched together really, really tightly so no air gets in there, and I get a nice clear print. And I expose it to ultraviolet light, sunlight, and then I have to develop it. And what my chemical sensitizing does is it makes the gelatin harden wherever the light hits it. And so when I put that into water, the gelatin starts to get soft. And so what I have to do is mate it underwater, my tissue, to a piece of glass in this case, or to a piece of paper, as most of them upstairs are. And I mate them underwater, pull them up, let that dry again, and then put it into a warm hot water in order to soften the rest of the gelatin. And once the gelatin's all soft, I can pull off that tissue and reuse it since it's plastic. And then eventually all the gelatin that has not been exposed to light will wash away in hot water. So my development process is just hot water. And then I'm left with an image on the glass. Sounds simple. So
much harder than painting.
It's just different from painting, I think. One of the things that happens with carbon printing in particular is that in that stage of development, the carbon tissue doesn't necessarily love to stick to glass, and it doesn't necessarily love to stick to paper either. And so you get these tears, and you get these bends, and you get places where the emulsion floats around. And I actually encourage that in my work. If you're doing formal carbon printing, then you don't want that. But that's what I was looking for, that, for a way for the images to be sort of torn and look like they'd been battered and gone through the fire. They drove through Ann's way to Sisters. And so really my idea of creating the work with the using carbon print was to take the ash and take that destruction and to create something beautiful out of it and something meaningful out of it, and to hope that I could touch people through that transformation of ash into this beauty, and get people to pay a little more attention and think a little bit about what it means to to be a human in our world today, and how we can help to make sure that we're here for a lot longer. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say.
I love the cross-pollination of this, just getting to hear from each of you your different techniques that you're bringing, and just the process. As a writer, the process for me is going out. It's multi-step as well. And so after the Eagle Creek fire, I was in that stage of grief where it was just like partly denial of, I didn't want to accept that this place that I thought was a rainforest was actually at risk of fire. But then it progressed to wanting to learn as much as I can, which is how I write. I go out and do hundreds of interviews. I read as much as I can. I learn the science. And so OSU, after the 2020 fires, put together this amazing series of talks that are still all available online. And they called it Wildfire Wednesdays. And it's just week after week of fire scientists, ecologists, indigenous leaders, community organizers that do Firewise and other projects, talking about the history of fire in this region. And for me, that was so calming, ironically, to learn that, in fact, fire is a really important part of this landscape that we know and love. And to indigenous people that were caretakers of this land from time immemorial, they understood deeply the relationship between fire and healthy ecosystems. And so when my settler ancestors arrived and displaced and removed indigenous people from the land and forbade them from using fire, we helped interrupt this cycle of a healthy ecosystem that had been in place for at least 10,000 years. And so all of the land here that we see in this catastrophic state of fire is not meant to reach that catastrophic state. Partly it's catastrophic because of climate change, and because we used to have a 2-month fire season in Oregon. We currently have a 7-month fire season in Oregon. Things are drier, things are hotter. When the rains do come, they're more intense, and so they don't soak into the soil. They rush off and take the topsoil with it, which pollutes our oceans. Like, it's all these big loops that are feeding each other. And so we do need to address the larger climate issues. But even if, like, may it be so, may we find a way to bring this back in balance, fire will still be part of living in this place that we love. And it will ideally be a healthy part of living in this place we love. Because these forests, up until settlers came and interrupted it, were burned by indigenous people intentionally, carefully, thoughtfully, every 2 to 7 years, depending on the ecoregion and its specifics. So like dry Eastern Oregon, where you have juniper and sage, that needs to have fire in it every 2 years. These big forests need, and I have an elder out in Corbett that I interviewed for the piece that I wrote for Topic magazine, which was later in Best American Science and Nature Writing, and he was explaining how for the Wasco people, they set fires just before the rains were going to come in the fall. They knew when the rains were going to come. People would carefully clear out the underbrush, because what you do not want then or now is ladder fuels, so it climbs up into the canopy, because these are canopy fires. This is where you have dug fir, and we didn't used to have, until colonization, predominantly dug fir forests. We had mixed forests. And when you have big leaf maple, other evergreen, I'm sorry, not evergreens, deciduous. When fire reaches those deciduous, wet green leaves, it slows down. That's what stopped the Eagle Creek fire. The wind died and it hit Bridal Veil where there are all these maples, and they slowed the fire down and it fell into the creek and rolled itself to a stop. But when it hits the Doug firs, they're so full of pitch, and when the fire is so hot that it creates its own weather system, they can snap off and break, and literally in the Eagle Creek fire blow 2 miles across the river into Washington and start a new fire.
Yep.
That is how intense these, they call them
Firestorms.
firestorms,
Mega fires.
mega fires. When they reach this state, that's when we're in trouble. But if we can keep fires low on the forest floor so they're burning out the undergrowth, like the only way that wagon trains were able to come through the Pacific Northwest is because indigenous people had been clearing the undergrowth. There was not rhododendron thickets that you had to like shoulder your way through. There were openings under the trees. And so it's learning to rethink, in part, how we live in this landscape that we love and shelters us, how to respect other ways of tending and caring for this place. And for me, I'm trying to learn to be less afraid of fire, to see it as this really vital and essential part of a healthy place. And so I'm very active in my Firewise community out in the Columbia River Gorge, because I understand now, living in a wildland urban interface, I'm part of the problem. I have this beautiful home surrounded by woods. It's not like a city where, there's perimeters, there's fire departments. I'm placing myself right on the edge of that. And it's both and. A lot of the volunteer firefighters from Corbett are people that live in this wildland urban interface, and they're very careful and very thoughtful about when we do our burn piles to remove the debris under our trees, and care deeply about these landscapes. And so for me, part of my practice is the moving towards the things I'm afraid of. So I went out and interviewed the people that I was not very brave the night of the Eagle Creek fire. I had small kids and I was packing up our stuff and really just thinking about me and my family. And I didn't have a plan in place, and I'd never thought about having a plan in place for wildfire. And there were other people that I met subsequently that I learned the night of the fire, they were knocking on the doors of their elderly neighbors, making sure they were setting up folding tables in the school parking lot as embers fell, and all 911 calls were being routed to their cell phone for animals, and she was sending out, okay, you've got a horse trailer, go up that driveway, get these sheep. Okay, you've got another one, you can drive up here and get these animals out. Because the animals, the horses, the cattle, their lungs can't handle the smoke. They're even more sensitive than we as humans are. So it's all the people that are coordinating these amazing efforts when, God forbid, there we are in this moment where people have to evacuate, and we're really thinking about the worst case scenario. And so I have one tiny little piece. I feel like I'm here as a writer. My words are on the walls. But then I also got to sneak in one little painting, and it was a photograph that I took when I hiked with a bunch of school children in Cascade Locks. And they were going back into what was called the charcoal forest to see the spring after the Eagle Creek fire, what was coming back amongst the charcoal. And there are species that need fire to live and thrive. And actually, we need fire in part to make sure that the woodpeckers that come after the wood-boring beetles get to nest in the snags. This is, as the elder in Corbett, Ken Smith, was explaining, this is where the huckleberries get to move into the open, cleared out. This is where the eagles nest in the snags. It's where the deer and the elk raise their young in the fresh green grass that's growing. It's really, really important. And I learned from the fire ecologists that we were with at the Forestry Center a few weeks ago that Oregon should have 20% of our forests are new growth forests. Even with all of the burns that we've had lately, we're only at 3%. Because we prioritize logging and having these mature forests that we can cut down and harvest, we're not really caring for the land as a whole and making sure that we have the biodiversity that we need to. So I'll stop talking now.
Hey, Apricot, I want to ask you, because you said we have all these mature forests. that we prioritize for logging. And to me, they're not mature.
No,
Right. I was going to say we have these middle-aged adolescent forests. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I wanted to.
No, and in fact, the really mature forests with
They're plantations.
Yeah, they are.
And there's no biodiversity.
Right. And that's the problem.
And
Yeah.
yet, there are also small Oregon timber farms, and I met a woman after the Forestry Center talk that are on the micro scale, 125 acres instead of tens upon thousands, that are actually trying to do sustainable forestry, where they're targeting a few trees to selectively thin. They're keeping mixed deciduous. And the problem is lumber costs more when you treat a forest like that, but it's the true cost. And it's the true cost. I mean, wildfires are incredibly expensive. So if we don't want to pay it there, we might want to consider paying it ahead of time by how we.
And there are things that all of us can do. Fit into your lifestyle. You don't have to. You just have to add a tiny step. Start with your house. Start with your neighbors. Everybody can do something. It's less dangerous and devastating, and take better care of our.
And it's so much better, I find, when I'm panicking alone in private and just writing in solitude. I'm a mess. I'm not great to live with. But when I am part of collective action and I'm out with my neighbors, and we hosted a Firewise tour at our house out in Corbett. So I invited a bunch of neighbors, about 15 to 20 of us, and we walked around with someone who's certified in analyzing your structure. You are certified now, right?
I am certified to analyze your structure.
You could go out and get certified, take this day-long class, and be available 2 days.
2 days.
Be available to your neighbors to help them understand what a safe home is. My house got everything wrong. The dryer vent with no cap, full of all the really flammable. Oh wait, fix that. The bamboo right next to the house, that will explode if fire hits it. Rosemary, full of oils that are volatile. The fire height is super high. Juniper, forget it. Arborvitae, those went cut down. Our house looks different now as a result of this tour, because the 5 feet around the perimeter of your house is the most important. Imagine a campfire. If you put a match on a big pile of logs, you're not going to get a campfire. If you put some embers on your house, it's not going to start a fire. But if you have kindling, if you have dry leaves caught right in the corner of the roof line and it can catch there and then get into the beams, if it can get sucked into the venting, they used to recommend 1/4-inch mesh screen for that, now 1/8-inch mesh, because just that much of a difference means that embers that do get through are too tiny to start a fire. But for 1/4-inch, they can start a fire in your attic.
Under your deck, that nice deck that's sitting there, and Amber crawls under there to buy a house. Lots of things you can do. 1/8-inch holes.
And there are dramatic photos post-fire in these devastated regions of the one house that followed all the steps recommended by Firewise, and it is still standing.
Yeah, completely leveled all around it, and the house is sitting. Yeah, it really is something you can do. And our Firewise, Portland Fire's public education officer always says, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You don't have to do it all tomorrow. You can do a little bit of it. It's doable. It's doable.
And I think the Washington version of it isn't called Firewise. There's a different one that you use statewide. But there's really great resources available online in the state of Washington for a similar, how do we collectively approach this issue and take action?
And I don't know about Vancouver or Washington's fire departments, but you could call them and ask them for the free evaluation. And if they don't have that, maybe they'll get it. Start doing it. Or call us. We'll come to find out specifically about it. Yeah.
I live in an apartment complex, and there really isn't much I could actually do. Is it their duty to harden the house for a car complex?
I have people ask me this question because I've turned into this insane old woman who walks around Forest Park all the time saying. And people that have apartments, I know a couple of them have gone home and made sure their apartment manager knows about this and thinks about it, and you can request it. And in a couple of, well, one case I know for sure, they started doing things there. So you can always ask. You can always bring up the conversation, and I have things you can show them. So, you know, they think you have an army behind you, and you do. Here we are.
If anything, I could just call the manager and let them know, you know, there was actually a brush fire last week.
Oh, yeah.
About, like, not far from where I live.
Yeah.
It was only like 2 acres, and it was snuffed out before it got too bad. But it was a bit scary, you know?
Yeah, and all structures should be evaluated.
So I could just say, I think maybe it's probably a good idea to help do some fire protection. Fire.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, whatever they call Firewise in Washington, they must have something akin to it. Firewise is a national thing, funded by FEMA, but whatever they call it here, and in our, you just need to have 8 homes agree that they want to Firewise and get it started. And it is good to have group activities and awareness and things like that. And I can tell you from my own trips back and forth into the Valley of Despair and out, action helps. It does. It really does help. And I bet all 3 of us feel like that, right?
Sure.
It's like we get adrenaline in crisis situations for a reason. It's to give our body that extra burst to like do something physical. When we're just sitting in front of our computer, that burst of adrenaline constantly surging through us will actually destroy us physically. So if you can do something physical with your anxiety and adrenaline, it helps you sleep better.
I have a question for all 3 of you. So we're talking about something that is essentially threatening.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it for all 3 of you as people who create things to have an element of hope in there in your work? How do you put it in there? How do you manifest it?
That's a really good question. I think that hope is really nice. I like it. But when I don't feel very hopeful, I feel a responsibility to use my voice. So, I mean, hope is what I aspire to and strive for. And on the days when I don't have it, I think it's your job to use your voice. Even if you don't want to, get out there and do it. And usually when I take action, I start feeling more hopeful. Like when I feel really terrible, I go for a walk in the forest. I must have a book. She's going to give you a card and tell you to go home and do something. But I feel better after I do it. Then I start feeling hopeful.
I would say that in terms of my work, and especially the Ghost Forest work, that creating something out of, having done this transformation of the soot into into a photograph, which is, and after all, carbon is the basic building block of life, and and the way we date things is carbon dating. And so I was releasing the memory of the molecules of carbon and letting them help us remember what the forest is, and where the forest is, and how the forest feels. And so I often think of my photographs not as photographs I've taken, but as a release of the forest memories, and that they're the forest memories, and I just happen to be the medium through which the forest is speaking, in a sense. And so that gives me hope that I could be this in between thing, that I could allow myself to be placed in the forest, be the voice of the forest, for the forest, because they don't have a voice, trees can't speak yet. And so it's, so that's sort of, I guess that's where the hope would come out for me in my work.
That's great.
I was on a hike last March with my teenagers, and some indigenous leaders in Southern California, the desert mountains where I grew up. And so they're from the Cahuilla Nation, and Sean that I was hiking with, and my 17-year-old that I was hiking with, Sean sings these bird song cycles that are 4,000 years old that have been kept alive in his tribe for that entire time. And they talk about migration, and they talk about cataclysmic events and how the people had to move hundreds of miles and arrive back home and see the land change and readjust. And so I was asking Sean and my son, how do you hold this question of hope and despair? I find like I'm cycling wildly through the two. And my 17-year-old said, well, Mom, if I just felt despair, then I wouldn't do anything and I would just give up. So I might as well choose hope and like take some action and do something and try to make the world a little better. And Sean said, for me, it's not about hope or despair. It's about gratitude. This earth that we are lucky to be on at this moment in time gives so much more to us than we can ever give back to the earth. And she is still taking care of us. Despite all that is hard right now, and it's hard for the earth to take care of us right now, we keep making it harder. But she's still there. And so our job in the time that we are alive on this earth is to express our gratitude to the earth. And for him, it was singing songs to the Creator as we walk on the earth and waking up each morning and singing a song.
Frontline has a documentary that our Firewise group showed a while back that I think you can get online that talks about the campfire, which was the one in Paradise, California. And it is jaw-dropping. If you can find it online, watch it. And it also was an instance of, it was sparks from electrical, big towers where the lines landed and started that fire. And they had fire evacuation plans, books like this, but that place has had one road going in and out forever. None of their evacuations planned. It's an amazing thing to see.
I want to add to your comment about the campfire in a couple of ways. One is that my pieces, my carbon prints, altogether there's 140 or will be 140 of them, and the part of the idea is that they're every year on average now we average 70,000 wildfires in the US, and 90% of them are caused by humans in some way. And so I originally started with 70 images as being the body of work to memorialize the 70,000 wildfires a year. And then as I worked on it, I discovered that we now burn 7 million acres a year. And so I decided to do 140 with another 70 images for the 7 million acres. And I just wanted to mention that also because actually we used to have, in like 1990 to 2000, we were averaging 100,000 wildfires a year, but we burned less than 1 million acres in those 100,000 fires. So while the number of fires has actually been decreasing, the size and the devastation as a result of those fires has gone way up. And so that's one of those flips that has quite a bit of it is climate driven. Absolutely. At that point. The campfire was very amazing though, because it moved at a rate of 83 miles an hour. So if you can imagine, a fire moving 83 miles an hour, there's no way you can outrun that. And that's one of the things that made it so particularly devastating.
Absolutely.
And
one other thing to get everybody excited about. I don't know if you noticed last weekend, all the wind. There were 11 fires last weekend in Oregon. 11. Mm-hmm. The one in the Dalles was one, but there were 11 fires, and it's that wind that is so. I don't know if that still happens or not.
That same happened in the Eagle Creek fire, and that's actually of benefit to the forest, right? Because it creates this mosaic pattern. So you have the actual mature trees. Right. That are big and have fire-resistant trunks, and they still have seeds that they're there intact, and they're dropping the native seeds into the burned area. That's part of what allows the earth to keep going.
Keep
It's
going.
it's the loss side by side with the newness, the new birth. the
And there's our
climate
hope.
returning. There's our hope.
Babies being born in the
Okay.
middle of the fire.
Quick plug. Mary's